The fire is already raging through the narrow streets. There are no organized cries, only voices broken by panic. Human shadows stumble, fall, disappear into the smoke. Roofs collapse as if the city were too tired to stand. The heat burns the lungs before it even touches the skin. And when silence arrives, it brings no relief. It brings only the question that no one dares to say aloud. How could the greatest city in the world burn like this? In the summer of 64 AD, Rome was ablaze. Not an ordinary fire, but a destruction that would span days, entire neighborhoods, and generations of memory. The capital of the most powerful empire on earth burned before the eyes of its own citizens. The event was not just an urban disaster. It was a profound rupture in trust, order, and the very idea of Roman civilization. When the flames finally subsided, Rome was no longer the same, and perhaps it had never been as fragile as it seemed at that moment. There's a recurring idea that Rome was already doomed, that the first century was just the beginning of the end. But this view ignores an uncomfortable truth. Before the fire, Rome was experiencing an unprecedented boom. The city concentrated wealth, political power, art, engineering, and trade on a global scale. Roads connected continents. Ships crossed the Mediterranean ceaselessly. Grains from Egypt, wine from Gaul, spices from the East filled the markets. Never before had so many lived so close to the center of power. And precisely for that reason, the collapse was so devastating. Rome was a living organism. More than 1 million people shared a chaotic, vibrant, and unequal space. Marble palaces coexisted wall to wall, with wooden buildings crammed with families. The city functioned on the basis of constant flow. Water, food, slaves, goods, information. Everything needed to circulate. Everything depended on stability. But that same density, that urban success, created an invisible risk. A single spark was enough for everything to be lost. The origin of the disaster didn't stem from conspiracies or grand plans. It began far from power. On a warm night, in crowded shops near the Circus Maximus, oil lamps, fabrics, dry wood. The fire had no intention. It simply found fuel. And in a city built to grow, not to resist, it ran free. The Romans didn't understand the behavior of large-scale urban fires. They had no means to contain them. What was invisible suddenly dominated everything. When the flames reached the heart of Rome, it was too late. The fire found narrow streets that acted as wind corridors. It found buildings too tall to escape. It found people who didn't know where to run. The port, the markets, the working-class neighborhoods became gateways to tragedy. Each new block set ablaze seemed to announce the definitive end of the eternal city. The spread was relentless. Day after day, Rome burned. Families abandoned their homes carrying what they could. Others returned to try to save something and were never seen again. Corpses remained in the streets untouched because no one dared approach. The smell of smoke mingled with that of burnt flesh. The civilized world watched, powerless, the collapse of its own symbol. Faced with the chaos, the Romans sought explanations. Some said the gods were angry. Others believed in political conspiracies. There were those who swore they had seen men deliberately fueling the flames. Technical knowledge was insufficient. The answers were emotional, and each attempt at control seemed to worsen the situation. Blocking streets, hastily demolishing houses, creating curtains of fire. Nothing worked as expected. When the fire finally began to recede, the damage was already irreversible. But the physical fire gave way to something even more dangerous. Social collapse. Family ties were broken. Neighbors began to see each other as threats. Properties were looted under the pretext of chaos. Laws ceased to be respected because there was no one left to enforce them. Roman morality, built on order and discipline, showed its most fragile face. Fear needed scapegoats, and Rome found them. Marginalized groups began to be accused, among them the Christians. A silent, misunderstood minority, they became the perfect scapegoat. The persecution was not just political, it was emotional. It was a desperate attempt to make sense of the absurd. Fanaticism was not born of power, but of collective fear. The impact wasn't limited to the city. The countryside felt the blow. Routes were disrupted, harvests were lost, villages were abandoned for lack of protection or trade. Where there was once human activity, weeds began to take over. The empire's economy felt the weight of a wounded capital. Rome was still the center of the world, but now it bore visible scars. The fire wasn't defeated, it simply ran out. When there was nothing left to burn, it ceased. The silence that followed brought no relief.